You know, this trail has a way of showing people who they really are, Carter said, tightening the strap on his pack. His voice carried an edge of mystery, a quiet confidence that always seemed to linger in the air around him. I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or just musing aloud, but the comment sent a ripple through my chest. Carter had that effect on people. He wasn't just my dad's friend. He was the kind of man you noticed before he even spoke, a towering presence with salt and pepper hair and a rugged, weathered look that hinted at a life lived boldly. "Is that so?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Absolutely," he replied, glancing back at me with a grin. "Out here, there's no hiding. You strip away the noise, and you're left with the truth." It was meant to sound profound, I think, but all I could focus on was the way his shirt clung to his back as we moved steadily uphill. My dad was supposed to be here. This entire hike had been his idea, a chance to unplug and bond. But when a last-minute work emergency came up, Carter offered to take me instead. My dad trusted Carter with everything, and it was easy to see why. He was the kind of guy who could fix a car, tell a great story, and still manage to make a room full of people laugh. I, on the other hand, was the opposite. Introverted, cautious, and much more comfortable behind a computer screen than in the wild. Spending a whole day hiking with Carter was equal parts intimidating and intriguing. The trailhead was serene, with the early morning light filtering through the trees. Birds chirped somewhere above us, and the scent of pine hung heavy in the cool air. Carter led the way with an easy stride, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You hike much?" he asked over his shoulder. "Not really," I admitted. "I usually spend my weekends binging shows or working on projects." He chuckled. "Figures. Your dad always says you're the quiet one. Nothing wrong with that, though. Quiet people tend to notice the important stuff." His words felt oddly validating, and I found myself smiling in spite of my awkwardness. As the hours passed, the trail grew steeper, and so did my admiration for Carter. He moved with an effortless grace, pointing out interesting plants, stopping to show me how to read the map, and even cracking a few self-deprecating jokes about how his knees weren't what they used to be. "Don't tell your dad I said that," he quipped, shooting me a wink. He'd never let me live it down. I laughed, more at his expression than the joke itself. It was easy to see why my dad looked up to him so much. Carter had this magnetic charm, the kind that made you want to impress him, even if you weren't sure why. By midday, we stopped at a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. Carter handed me a water bottle and plopped down on a nearby rock, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not bad, huh?" he asked, gesturing to the endless expanse of green. "It's incredible," I said, and I meant it. For someone who usually preferred the indoors, I had to admit the view was worth the effort. Carter studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said, almost to himself. That caught me off guard. "Really?" "Yeah. Quiet, observant. But there's a lot going on in here," he said, tapping his temple. "Am I right?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he could see straight through the walls I'd spent years building. It was both unnerving and oddly comforting. The mood shifted as we packed up and resumed the hike. The trail was less defined now, overgrown in places and littered with fallen branches. Carter took the lead, his confidence unwavering. "Stay close," he called back to me. "This part can get tricky." But tricky didn't begin to cover it. Within an hour, we realized we'd missed a turn somewhere. The map didn't match the terrain, and the more we tried to backtrack, the more disoriented we became. "This doesn't look right," I said, glancing around at the dense forest. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "We'll figure it out. Worst case, we set up camp and head back in the morning." The idea of spending the night out here sent a shiver down my spine. but I trusted him. I had to. By the time we decided to stop for the night, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Carter set up a small fire, his movements precise and practiced. "Not exactly the day we planned, huh?" he said, his voice carrying a hint of apology. I shook my head, offering a weak smile. "Not exactly." He looked at me then, his eyes catching the firelight. "You're handling this better than most people would." I wasn't sure how to respond. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't quite put into words. A pull, a spark, a connection that left me both exhilarated and uneasy. And I had a feeling this night was far from over. "It's strange, isn't it?" Carter said, his voice low as he stared into the flickering firelight. "How being out here can make you feel more exposed than any room full of people ever could." I didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words hung heavy between us, and the way he said it, slow, deliberate, made it clear he wasn't just talking about the wilderness. "I guess," I said finally, pulling my knees up to my chest. "It's like there's nowhere to hide." Carter's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Exactly." We sat in silence for a moment, the crackling fire filling the void. The forest around us seemed alive, the rustle of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures amplifying the intimacy of our isolation. I glanced at Carter, his face softened by the fire's glow. There was something about him in this moment, something raw and unguarded. "I've been out here 100 times," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it never feels like this." "Like what?" I asked, my curiosity outweighing my hesitation. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Like I'm not alone and yet more exposed than ever." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. This was Carter, the confident, larger-than-life man who seemed untouchable. Seeing him like this felt almost surreal, as if I were privy to a part of him no one else had seen. "It's not always easy," he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire, "carrying the weight of being what everyone expects you to be. A husband, a father figure, a friend." I swallowed hard, unsure whether to speak. Part of me wanted to reach out, to say something comforting, but the other part of me was afraid of what might happen if I did. "And sometimes," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you just forget who you are." The air between us grew heavier, charged with something unspoken, yet undeniable. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. "You ever feel like that?" he asked, finally looking at me. His eyes were piercing, searching mine for an answer I wasn't sure I had. "Yeah," I admitted softly. "All the time." Carter let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Pretending everything's fine when it's not." I nodded, unable to find the words. The fire popped loudly, breaking the tension for a brief moment. Carter leaned back, resting his weight on his hands, and looked up at the stars. "When I was your age," he said, "I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted out of life. But the truth is, I didn't have a damn clue." His honesty hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always seen him as someone who had it all together, someone who was unshakable. "And now?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Now, I think I'm starting to realize what I've been missing." The words hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. My breath caught in my throat as he leaned slightly closer, his gaze flickering to my lips before meeting my eyes again. "Carter," I whispered, unsure if it was meant as a warning or an invitation. He hesitated, his jaw tightening, as if he were battling some internal war. But then, with a sudden, almost desperate resolve, he closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, his lips brushing against mine, as though testing the boundaries. But when I didn't pull away, it deepened, a wave of intensity washing over both of us. His hand cupped the side of my face, rough yet gentle, and I felt myself melting into the moment. It wasn't just a kiss. It was years of loneliness, longing, and suppressed desire unraveling all at once. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, the fire casting shadows across our flushed faces. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice hoarse with guilt. "Carter," I started, but he held up a hand, cutting me off. "No, listen," he said, his tone firm but tinged with regret. This can't happen. I have responsibilities. A wife. Your dad. This isn't right." His words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand over his face. I don't know what came over me." The rest of the night passed in near silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us like a physical force. Carter kept his distance, avoiding my gaze, and I didn't push him. As I lay down on the makeshift bedding, staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a fleeting lapse in judgment, but another part of me knew better. The dawn broke in streaks of pale orange and soft lavender, casting a muted light over the clearing. I awoke to the sound of rustling, my heart sinking as I realized Carter was already packing up the campsite. His movements were quick, methodical, and deliberately focused on anything but me. "We should get moving," he said without looking up, his voice flat and distant. I sat up slowly, the chill of the morning air doing little to quell the heat of everything that had transpired the night before. For a moment, I considered saying something, but the tightness in Carter's jaw warned me against it. The hike back to the main trail was steeped in silence, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the forest floor and the occasional snap of a twig. Carter led the way, his broad shoulders tense beneath the weight of his pack. Every step felt heavier than the last. I couldn't stop replaying the kiss in my mind, how natural it had felt, how consuming. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more the guilt crept in, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. When we finally stumbled back onto the marked trail, Carter stopped abruptly, turning to face me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions, regret, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Look," he began, running a hand through his disheveled hair, "about last night." I swallowed hard, bracing myself. "It was a mistake," he said, his voice firm but tinged with a sadness that cut through me. "It shouldn't have happened. It can't happen again." I nodded, though the ache in my chest made it difficult to breathe. "I understand." The rest of the hike back was a blur. Carter kept a careful distance, avoiding any moments that might force us to address what had happened. By the time we reached the parking lot, the tension between us had grown unbearable. Carter leaned against his truck, crossing his arms as he looked out over the horizon. "I care about you, you know," he said softly, not meeting my gaze. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I care about you too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, a bitter smile flickering across his lips. "But this, whatever this is, it can't go anywhere. It would destroy too much." I knew he was right, but hearing him say it made it feel final in a way I wasn't ready for. "What happens now?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We move on. We pretend it didn't happen." I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't that simple, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't just saying it for my sake. He needed it to be true. The drive back to town was excruciating. Carter kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur into a mosaic of green and brown. When we finally pulled into my driveway, he killed the engine but didn't make a move to get out. "You'll be okay," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I don't know," I admitted, meeting his gaze for the first time since we'd left the forest. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, but instead, he simply nodded. "Take care of yourself, all right?" And just like that, he was gone. The days that followed were a haze. Carter stopped coming around the house as often, and when he did, he kept his distance. My dad didn't seem to notice the change, but every interaction felt like a knife twisting deeper into the wound. I threw myself into work and avoided any conversations that might lead back to the hike. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that night, of the firelight dancing in his eyes, of the way his lips had felt against mine. Weeks turned into months, and though the ache dulled with time, it never completely went away. I'd catch myself thinking about him at the most random moments. A song on the radio, the smell of pine, the flicker of a candle. I wasn't naive enough to believe it could have worked. Carter was married, loyal to my father, and bound by a life that didn't have room for me. But even knowing that, I couldn't shake the feeling that, for one fleeting moment, we had shared something real. The last time I saw Carter was at a barbecue my dad hosted in late summer. He greeted me with a polite nod, his expression carefully neutral. But when our eyes met across the yard, I saw it. The flicker of something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between us. We didn't speak that day, and I left early, the weight of his presence too much to bear. As I walked away, I realized something. Some connections aren't meant to last. They exist in the in-between spaces, shaping us in ways we can't fully understand, but never truly leave behind. And while part of me would always wonder what could have been, another part knew it was better this way. Some truths, after all, are better left in the silence of the forest. If you have liked the story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.